Hi folks, these are the video segments for solution to homework number 14, which is suggested problems from section 4.2 in the textbook. All right, so let's start with problem number 3. Okay, good. So number 3, we have sine of 75 degrees, and the idea is to use the addition and subtraction rules that we learned in this section in order to get the exact value for this particular sine. Do not put this in your calculator. Of course, to check your answer, you can do that. So I'm going to write this thing as sine of, I have to write it as two angles that are recognized, the sine and cosine. For example, 30 degrees plus 45 degrees. Okay, so now we know that based on the formula for sine of the sum of two angles, this is sine of 30 degrees, cosine of 45 degrees, plus cosine of 30 degrees, sine of 45 degrees. This is the formula for sine of A plus B. Okay, so now this thing is 1/2. That is root 2 over 2, or 1 over root 2, whichever you want. This thing is root 3 over 2. Cosine of 30 is root 3 over 2. And of course, sine of 45 is also root 2 over 2. So this is the way we have to solve these problems. Let's do number 4. We have sine of 15 degrees. So what I'm going to do, write this thing as sine of 45 degrees minus 30 degrees, because now I have the sine of the difference of two angles. There's a formula for it, and it's sine of 45 cosine of 30 minus cosine of 45 sine of 30 degrees. Okay? So now just plug it in. So that's going to be root 2 over 2. Cosine of 30 is root 3 over 2 minus cosine of 45 is root 2 over 2, and sine of 30 is 1/2. You can always put this thing in your calculator and put these in your calculator, see if the two numbers are the same. That's a good way to double check your work. Okay. You will have problems of this type on the quiz, so we should practice it. Number 5. So we have cosine of 105, and I'm going to write this thing as, for example, of cosine of let's say 60 degrees plus 45 degrees, because for each one of them I know sine and cosine. And now we go to the formula for cosine of the sum of two things, and if you go to your book, you see that cosine of a sine looks like this. Sum is equal to like this: cosine of 60 cosine of 45, and yes, minus. When this is plus, for cosine, that thing in between becomes a minus. That's a common thing that people forget. So these are going to be sine of 60 degrees, sine of 45 degrees. Okay, so each one of them we know. This one is 1/2. This one is root 2 over 2 minus root 3 over 2, and of course root 2 over 2. So another one, number 6. I guess I have to insert a page. Insert a page, blank page. Oh. Okay, so let's do number 6. We have cosine of 195 degrees. So what I'm going to do this thing is to write this thing as maybe, let's see now, what's the best way of breaking this down so that we get angles that you recognize. Now, you may have to try a few things. For example, this one I can write it as, let's say, 145 plus 135. Sorry, that's 135 plus 60. Yep, that's a good idea. Good idea. So you have cosine of 135 plus 60. Okay. There may be different ways of doing these problems, but that's how I'm going to do that. So it's going to be cosine of 135, cosine of 60, minus sine of 135, sine of 60. Okay? Now, this thing, the reference angle for 135 is 45, and because it's the angle is bigger than 180, so this is minus root 2 over 2. Remember, 135, the reference angle is 45. Cosine of 45 is positive, but this is 135. It's on the negative side of cosine axis. Okay, and this is, of course, is 1/2 minus sine of 135, the same as sine of 45, which is root 2 over 2. That's this, and then this is root 3 over 2. The moral of the story is that this is minus root 2 over 2 times 1/2 minus root 2 over 2 root 3 over 2. I don't expect you to put these in your calculator, because once you put it in your calculator, then it's not going to be exact anymore. And the problem says do the exact value. Okay, let's try this one, number 9. Sine of 19 pi over 12. Okay, so this time it's not giving an angle in degrees, so let's do it like this. Sine of, for example, now see, what is this? This can be written as, for example, let's see now. We've got to try different things because, for example, one way is to write it as pi plus 7 pi over 12. Problem is that 7 pi over 12, I know this, but do I recognize 7 pi over 12? Now let's think about 7 pi over 12 is, if you pi over 12 is 30 degrees. No, 15 degrees, right? Pi over 12 is 15 degrees. If you multiply 15 by 7, you're going to get 105. Do I recognize 105? Yeah, a 60. Okay, so let's do it like this then. Let's do it like this. Well, it's easier for me to look at this thing as degrees. So let's see now. Let's think about this thing for a second. Pi plus 7 pi over 12. One more time, okay? Now I know anything about this. Now this one in degrees, pi over 12 is 15. 7 times 15 is 105. And can I think of 105 as pi over 6 plus pi over 105 is 60 plus 45, so pi over 3 plus this is pi over 4. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. Okay, I'm going to break it up like that, but then later I have to do 2 steps. As I said, these are not the best, necessarily the fastest way of doing it, but that's okay. So let me get rid of all this stuff. Okay. Okay. All right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write this thing as sine pi plus 7 pi over 12. And yeah, and now I'm going to use this thing, the sign of the sum. So it's going to be sine of pi cosine of 7 pi over 12 plus cosine of pi sine of 7 pi over 12. Okay, now this is 0, and this is minus 1. So this is cosine of 7 pi over 12 minus sine of 7 pi over 12. Now, I did some detective work and find out what this thing was. Remember, this was 105 degrees, so it was pi over 3 plus pi over 4, right? If you add these up, you get exactly what's on the top, minus sine of pi over 3 plus pi over 4. Now, for each one of these, I can apply my formulas. Like this one, the first one I'm going to put it in bracket. So it's going to be cosine of pi over 3, cosine of pi over 4, minus sine of pi over 3, sine of pi over 4. That takes care of the first term, this term. And this one, we have sine of the sum of two angles. So it's going to be sine of pi over 3, cosine of pi over 4, plus cosine of pi over 3, sine of pi over 4. And each one of these, we know what it is. So let's plug it in. Cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. Cosine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. Sine of pi over 3 is root 3 over 2. Sine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. Minus sine of pi over 3 is root 3 over 2. Again, this is root 2 over 2. Minus this one is 1/2. Cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. And this is root 2 over 2. Now, please note that if you are checking the answer in the book, it would not look like this, because in all likelihood they have attempted to they have attempted to simplify that. You see this? The answer in the book would not be something like that. They do the multiplication and clean it up. I suggest that you do that and you make sure that you can get the answers in the book. Okay, let's do another one. The last of this block, number 10, and then I'm going to stop this video. I'll move on to another video segment. So insert, page, blank page. Oh, my blank pages are all in the wrong spot. Okay, so let's go here. View. Right there. One page. Okay, good. This one is number 10. And at the same time, you have to do the same kind of thing. Cosine of 17 pi over 12. You may have to take several steps to do this. So for example, let me write this as cosine of pi plus 5 pi over 12. Okay, there may be other ways of doing it. And this is going to be cosine of pi, cosine of 5 pi over 12. And then minus sine pi, sine 5 pi over 12. But remember, this is 0 and this is minus 1. So this is minus cosine of 5 pi over 12. Now you have to do something with this guy. Oops. Now you have to do something with that guy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write it as cosine. Now, notice that 5 pi over 12, it's easier for me to think about it in terms of degrees. Pi over 12 is 15. 5 pi over 12 is going to be 75. So I'm going to write this 75 degrees as pi over 6, that's 30, plus pi over 4, because otherwise it's not obvious how we should break this up. So now we have this thing as negative cosine of pi over 6, cosine of pi over 4, minus, remember, when this is a plus, for cosine, this becomes a minus. See that? Sine of pi over 6, sine of pi over 4. Okay? Now, this stuff we can substitute. Cosine of pi over 6 is root 3 over 2. This is root 2 over 2. That is root 2 over 2 minus 1/2 times root 2. Again, the answer in the book is not going to look like this, but if you manipulate this, you should be getting the answer in the book, if there is one. Otherwise, the only way to check it is take this number, stick it in your calculator, take this number, stick it in your calculator. These should be either exactly the same or extremely close. Otherwise, you made something, you made the wrong algebra calculation.